Welcome to the TES Maths Podcast, hosted by Craig Barton.
Welcome to episode 9 of the TES Maths Podcast with me, Craig Barton. Here once again with your monthly serving of mathematical news, ideas, resources and discussion. Following last episode's gallivanting around the primary schools of the Northwest, today I found myself back in our London studio where I am delighted to say I am joined by a very special guest. Andrew Blair may be a name that is unfamiliar to many listeners, but hopefully we can change that by the end of the episode. Andrew is Head of Department at Vardeen School in Brighton. He's been Head of Department in 2 different schools, covering a span of 12 years. His website, Inquiry Maths, contains some wonderful, rich lesson ideas that can stretch and challenge students and enable them to be creative in their mathematics, as my very own students found out earlier this week. So, a big hello to Andrew and thanks so much for joining us today.
Hello Craig, thank you for inviting me.
And a massive thank you to Andrew's school for allowing him to take part in the show. As usual, links to everything we discussed today can be found on our dedicated podcast page. That is www.tes.co.uk/mathspodcast. And in a brand new exciting feature, you will also find a link to a blog post where you can comment on the issues raised in this episode. And just to remind you that if you're not already following at TES Maths on Twitter, then what on earth are you playing at, because you're missing out on a world of daily resources and ideas. But enough of all that, let's get the show started. So for the first part of this show, I want to talk about Andrew's website, Inquiry Maths. Now I must confess that this was a brand new website to me and I found out about it, of all places, in Bangkok in Shrewsbury International School. So Andrew, for listeners who've never been to your website and never heard of these inquiries, could you start by just giving us a general feel of what an inquiry is and what does it involve?
Okay Craig, inquiry is a broad umbrella term, and there are many sorts of inquiries. The kind of inquiries that I run, Inquiry Maths, have 3 main features.
Okay.
First of all, I want the activity to develop from students' questions. So I expect them to comment or ask a question about a prompt that I give them. A prompt might be a statement, an equation or a diagram. So the activity that develops through the lesson comes from their questions. That's the first main feature. The second one is I require or would like students to regulate their learning. And that means that I invite them to structure the lesson. So I don't go in with any pre-planned 3-part lesson or any part lesson, and I would expect them to decide how they're going to learn, what they're going to learn even at the most open kind of level of inquiry, and how they're going to learn it. And I use cards to help them decide on the direction of the lesson. And the third main feature of the lesson is that learning is not pre-programmed in a way. Okay. There's no outcome that I have in mind. It's not discovery learning where I expect them to discover something that I already know.
Okay.
So every prompt will be related to the curriculum. Every kind of prompt is valid in terms of the maths curriculum in this country, and they will take that prompt the students will take that prompt in different directions. So, I mean, why I like inquiry learning is students are not only learning maths concepts and skills, they're also learning how to learn those concepts and skills. So there's a double learning going on in a way.
Well, you've hooked me in here, so
excellent.
I think the best thing to do is, could you perhaps describe an inquiry that you've run recently, and we'll go through it kind of almost minute by minute in the lesson, what you're doing, what the students are doing, if that's all right.
Okay, well, I've been doing one, well, I'm halfway through one at the moment, in fact, with a Year 10 class.
And could you, just for the context, this Year 10, what kind of ability range?
Okay, well this is a top set. I have done inquiries with all different levels, all different sets, and we can talk about some of that later perhaps.
Superb.
And I've taught all ability class as well, inquiries. But this is a top set. There are 33 in the class. And I put a statement on the board and ask them to pose some questions and make some statements about my statement.
All right, and what's the statement?
Okay, the one I used this week with them is the difference, sum and product of 2 numbers are the first 3 terms of a sequence.
All right, one more time.
Okay, the difference, sum and product of 2 numbers are the first 3 terms of a sequence.
And that's it.
That's it.
That's on the board.
That's it.
That's it.
I would say I ran this inquiry in an open way.
Right.
So there are different levels of openness, and different levels of how much I might structure an inquiry. But this particular one, because we've done inquiries before, I left it. I deliberately wanted to run it in an open way.
Okay. So the kids are sat there. This is on the board.
Yes.
What do they do?
Well, they have 5 minutes, say, to jot down some ideas, some questions. Some of them use the time to explore, and then they fed back what the questions that they'd written down, or what they'd noticed, or the statements they wanted to make.
And are they sat in groups or on their own?
Well, in this particular classroom, I don't have my own classroom. They're in tables of 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And could you give give us an example of some of the kind of questions that the students might come up with?
Okay. So in this case, a lot of questions were about: is it true? Does it work? There was one claim that it always worked. There was another claim that sometimes worked, and we kind of skirted around those claims. We didn't go into detail at this stage into that. Another student asked if different sum and product had to be in that order.
Right.
And a further pair then said, well, if it's not in that order, if it's different product sum,
Yeah.
it would work with 1 and 2. The difference 1, the product 2, and the sum 3. So we decided that was a bit too easy. We've left that to inquire into later.
Right.
Reordering different sum and product.
So you're limiting.
So we're limiting as we go, and this is a negotiation with the class in a way. Another student said, well, I've tried 5 and 10 and came up with difference 5, sum 10 and product 50.
Yeah.
And we got into a brief discussion about whether that actually was a sequence. Could it be turned into a sequence? And we decided that we would work initially in the inquiry with linear sequences only. Yeah.
Okay. Could you just give me an example of one that the students found that worked, that fit into a linear sequence? What numbers?
Okay, well, two students at this stage came up independently with 2 and 6. So the difference is 4, the sum is 8, and the product's 12.
Perfect. Okay.
It transpired actually. What happened then is we got it transpired that a lot of students had explored, and they didn't declare that immediately.
Right.
So when this came out, I then was able to list a number of different attempts to make this work, and we got 3 or 4 examples that did work.
Yep.
And then we started to conjecture about what pairs of numbers did work, did lead into the first 3 terms, or did give the first 3 terms of a linear sequence.
I see. So how far into the lesson are we at this stage?
Probably about 20 minutes.
About 20 minutes.
Yes.
And is this, you're at the board now, I assume you've listed these numbers down.
Yes.
And then, so the students are hooked in. They've found some numbers that work, some numbers that don't work. And where does the lesson go from there?
Just on hooked in.
Oh, yes. I
think that's a very good phrase. And inquiries have to be set to hook students in, to pique their curiosity, I suppose.
Sure.
They have to be set just above the current understanding of the class.
Okay.
So they recognise parts of it. They might not recognise the whole or understand the whole of it. They might need an orientation phase to try and work out exactly what it's saying. But it's a very skilled job, I suppose, to set these prompts at exactly the right level where students are not intimidated, not turned off, and feel confident enough to raise questions and make comments. What was your question, Craig? I got lost there. I got sidetracked there.
No,
sorry.
you're right. You were hooked in.
Yeah, I was hooked in. Exactly.
So we're at the stage of the lesson now where we found things that work and things that don't work.
Right.
And then where does the lesson go from there?
Okay. Well, at that point, what I've found in my early work with inquiries is that students just want to explore.
Right.
If they can see something that works, they want to make it work more, or they want more ways of making it work. And a part of inquiry maths, a very important part of inquiry maths, is saying stop, reflect on what's happening, decide where we're going, decide what the problem is perhaps, let's work out how the rest of the lesson is going to pan out. And initially I would say to students, what shall we do now?
Right.
And I was in the early work, I was often met with blank expressions
of
incomprehension.
Yeah, of course.
Because not only have they never been asked to ask questions, they've never been asked to structure a lesson.
No, definitely.
Yeah. So I was met in the early days with total incomprehension, and now I support that phase with a set of cards, and students can select a card, or pairs of students can select one in a more advanced class, they might actually select a series of cards and say we're going to do this, this and this. And then we decide from the cards they've selected how the rest of the lesson will go.
And does it matter if one set of students wants to take it one way and another wants to take it another way? Is that okay, or do we all have to kind of go in the same direction from this point?
That's a very interesting question, and that is where the skill of the inquiry teacher comes in, because the final arbiter is the teacher, and the teacher will decide based on the selections that students have made what is the best way forward. So if students are saying, we want to work in groups and we want to work on this, normally I would say fine. If you've defined an area you're going to work in, and you've defined it mathematically and it's valid, and you know how you're going to work, off you go. And maybe the class will split into different groups and explore different parts of the inquiry that they've, or the different questions that they've identified at the start. Other times it might be more sequential, so someone says we need, or I don't know, maybe a third of the class would say we need instruction. We don't know how to add fractions in one particular inquiry on the website. We don't know how to add fractions, so I will either ask students if they've got the knowledge and someone will come and instruct the students, or I will instruct the students because we need an understanding of how to do that. And then, in terms of it being sequential, then I might say, okay, now we're going to do that, now we're going to do that, and then we're going to do that.
Could you just give us an example of what might be on one of these prompt cards for this particular sequence-based
Okay,
lesson?
well, in the one in year 10, a lot of students wanted to work as a group.
Right.
So some of the cards actually say are more about how we're going to work. Are we going to work individually? Are we going to work as a group? Some are about the mathematical approach we're going to take. Are we going to explore? Are we going to try and prove something? Are we going to do calculations? So there's ones like that. Some are about, interesting, there's one, I want to do a worksheet.
Right,
I want out of this inquiry.
Right.
It's too freeform, and actually today I just want to do 20 questions, please.
Okay, and
So
that's okay.
That's a totally legitimate request from a student. I will learn best today with what with what we're doing. I will learn best in this form.
But it's still related to the
Yes.
so it'll be a sequence-based.
Exactly.
Thing in this
So
particular
the
example.
inquiry teacher, some teachers say to me, you just want an easy life. You just want to prepare a statement and leave it at that and get a few cards together. But actually, I have to think, the inquiry teacher has to think, what are the different paths that could open up from this starting point, and how will I resource each of those paths if they do open up? And I get requests like I would like to use a worksheet, or at a certain point in the inquiry I might want to close it down as the inquiry teacher, and I might need to resource that moment when I say, hold on, right, okay, we're not making much progress, we need a focused session on adding fractions, going back to that, here's 10 questions. So I need to think about the different pathways that could develop and resource those.
Okay. Now,
so it's not an easy life, Craig.
No, I can imagine. Now, for the record, I love this. I'm a great believer in giving students ownership over their learning and giving students the choice to take their lesson where they want and take their learning where they want. And I think that if you give students that choice and that responsibility, more often than not, they rise to it. And you're going to get students who see it as an opportunity to kind of mess around or whatever and be off task. But I think the majority of students will rise to this. Having said that, I'm going to play devil's advocate.
Well, can I just say?
Of course, yeah.
Can I just say, I find my classes, I find the discipline and inquiry lesson better. Maybe not initially.
Yes.
Maybe there's the teething problems from the teacher's side and the student's side. What's this all about, folks? But after a time, the levels of motivation rise so significantly because students are answering their own questions. That is so empowering for a student.
Right, so if I play devil's advocate a bit here.
Yes.
So the first thing that's springing to mind is, imagine I'm an NQT or a teacher that's coming up and I'm about to be watched by my head of department or a fellow teacher or someone from the authority who's judging my NQT, whether I'm going to pass or fail.
Yes.
And I think, right, I'm loving the sound of this. I'm going to do one of these inquiry lessons.
Yes.
What on earth am I putting on my lesson plan? Am I just putting, I'm going to ask a statement and see where the lesson goes? Because I certainly can't say, in the first 10 minutes we're going to do this, then in the next 10 minutes we're going to be working on this, because by definition I don't know, if we do it as open as this is,
yes,
I don't know where the lesson's going to go.
Yes.
So what, in terms of a lesson plan, what are we looking at here?
Well, I would say that I've done an interview lesson teaching inquiry, not very open,
Yes.
but you know, significantly open.
To a group of students who'd never done it
that I'd
before?
never even seen.
Right.
So I've done that. I know PGC students that I've run workshops for who have gone on to use my ideas or the inquiry ideas and get jobs through it. So I think there is an appetite in the educational community, the maths educational community, for this type of learning and this approach. I would also say, you know, the Ofsted outstanding criteria says nurturing mathematical independence.
Yeah.
And while we're on this point, I know this is nothing to do with what you asked.
Let's do it.
But while we're on this point, the draft programme of study for Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4, one of the 3 aims, it explicitly says, reason mathematically by following a line of inquiry. So I think inquiry, its time has come, perhaps.
We could just do with a little hyperlink to your website after that.
The draft curriculum. Yeah, I'd have to get hold of the Department of Education at this point. Yeah, so what would I say to an NQT? What I would say to an NQT or an inexperienced teacher, I would say don't run it in an open way. Close it down. Maybe just put the prompt on the board and ask for statements and questions. Get 1 or 2 from the class, which you can return to in the plenary. And run a normal lesson after that, whatever you consider a normal lesson. In terms of the lesson plan, well, my lesson plan did, have the prompt. It had the expected kind of questions that might develop from that, because each prompt is linked to the national curriculum, so I know the pathways that can develop from it. And then I might show, the 2 or 3 main pathways, how I've resourced them, and how I would expect, or the kind of activities I would expect to do around those pathways. I find that top sets who have had success, in the traditional way of answering 20 questions successfully, putting their hand up when the teacher asks a question and getting it right, to be colloquial, it completely freaks them out, this kind of learning, because they've never been expected to think about how the lesson will be structured, or even ask a question of their own, perhaps. And so top sets get more concerned and more anxious about inquiries than any other group of students, I think, in secondary schools.
Well, if I can just pick you up on that, then. Well, if that's...
I don't think I've asked you different.
Oh, no.
Okay, another one.
But if that's the case, and I'm again playing devil's advocate, should top sets be doing stuff like that then? Because absolutely. I mean, when they get to university, universities complain that students haven't got the metacognitive skills to plan their learning, to direct their learning, to learn independently. And it's precisely those students who, at university that need those skills. What I find is that inquiries, there's an orientation phase, there's a slow phase that sometimes teachers get anxious about, because if someone came in at that point, maybe the pace is slow. There's legitimate learning going on, and there's debate and there's questions, all the things that Ofsted want to see, I would say. But in terms of learning, in that initial phase, sometimes it might seem slow. Sure.
And an observer might pick you up on pace.
Yes.
But what I find is that inquiries accelerate very fast after that initial phase. And students are extremely motivated at learning or at trying to answer their own questions, at trying to deal with their own comments. And those high levels of motivation lead to much deeper and more effective learning in the longer term. So I think there is even after 10 years of teaching inquiries, I'm not concerned now, because I know there's an initial phase when we are orientating ourselves towards the prompt and deciding on how we're going to structure the lesson, and that does take time.
Now, right, well, let's say this. So you're asking students to take responsibility for their own learning and come up with their own questions for inquiry.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned before that you've done this with all ages and all abilities.
Yes.
And I think I'm right in saying you also mentioned that in year 7 and 8 yours are taught in mixed ability groups.
Yes.
Now, if I just reference, I'm a big fan, and I don't know if you are, of Jo Bowler and her book, The Elephant in the Classroom. And I've often been a big fan of mixed ability teaching, and I know a lot of maths teachers kind of shy away from it because it's a scary prospect. But I would imagine an inquiry lesson like this lends itself very nicely to mixed ability groups, because you will have everybody kind of rising up to the level, because you'll have some students who kind of grasp it, who can ask the really kind of thought-provoking questions, and other students in the group who perhaps are lower ability will learn from that and kind of rise up. And I imagine that would be a kind of really beautiful thing to see.
Yes.
But counter to that, can this really work on a setted year 7 and 8 middle set, low set?
Well, I think, I've done it with all sorts of classes, setted classes, 7 to 11, mixed ability in 7 and 8, and I suppose I prefer, philosophically, I prefer all ability classes, and I think it works effectively there. But I know it works in all situations with all different sorts of classes. So, in a way, as I said earlier, I find the higher sets later on in years 10 and 11 who are more, not necessarily resistant, more anxious, that suddenly their learning, their style of learning that they've been successful in is taken away from them, and they're actually being asked to consider a whole new series of questions that they've never been asked to consider before.
And again, it's that thing that we've mentioned before, isn't it, that if you empower students like that, and if you have high expectations for them, they do tend to rise up to
yes,
that,
I mean, people say to me, how do you deal with this with a bottom set? I mean, you can't use this open approach with a bottom set, and I would say, well, I'm not suggesting that you do, not initially anyway.
Yeah.
You might the first attempt to do this, you might offer the prompt. You might get one question. You might get one statement. It's very important how you deal with that statement. I would immediately, if it was a question, say, what does that mean? I would immediately write that on the board. I would put the name next to it. I would return to it later in the lesson. I would promote that question as a central part of the lesson. And it's the way the teacher deals with the responses that they get that makes this successful in the end. And the teacher has to promote that process. There are ways. There's a book called The Art of Posing Problems, I think, which has a structured way to encourage students to ask questions, or to a process by which they can ask their own questions, because most students, probably many, if not all, have never been asked to respond in this way and to set their own questions and make their own statements, make conjectures in the classroom in such an open forum anyway. And so there are ways, and they're documented on the website, there are ways to encourage students and help them ask those kind of questions and get started. But with a low ability class, you ask a question, right, thank you, we'll close it down now, and here's the activity that we're going to do now, and let's return to it later in the plenary. Let's return to their question later in the plenary. Still the name. And what I've also done in the past is, then we've got the answer to that. So I would type out the question, the name next to it, the answer. We will stick it in our books. That is
nice.
Whoever's question, and that really that really encourages that process. Yeah,
that's nice. As a head of department,
yes,
I'm sure you fully appreciate the need to get data down to whether it's levels and demonstrate progress and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So how am I demonstrating progress? So if Ofsted or my line manager comes in and looks on the mark sheet for year 8, what were they doing for that 2 weeks? Oh, they were doing an inquiry. Well,
right.
Where's it shown? Can you assign levels to this?
Yes.
How do you mark them? How do you show progress?
Well, okay. So there's different ways to assess students during an inquiry, and that's all again documented on the website. So one way might be to take in the portfolio of work that they've done, the ideas that they've got, and I would assign that a level depending on the mathematical skills and concepts that are shown there. And the work that I get back is very, very personalised and very, very different one from the other. And so I can be even more confident in a way of the level or the grade that I'm assigning, because the work has been created by them. It's not 5 answers, 10 answers to an exercise. Interestingly, in the phase when they are deciding what to do and the cards they choose, that's often a sign of their mathematical thinking. So if they choose the card, I always look for this one. If they choose the card, decide what the problem is, I think that student is thinking mathematically. That's where we need to start, and that's a good sign to me. If they choose the card, I want to work in a group, that might be a sign that they're a bit anxious about it and they need some support. So even at that stage, I'm assessing all the time. I'm assessing by the questions they ask, the statements they make. I'm assessing the presentations at the end. So I might not ask every group to present at the end, but I would expect some students to come to present the work or the progress that they've made at the end of a lesson or the end of the inquiry. So there are multiple ways I can assess.
You've convinced me on assessment.
Excellent. The data's all there, sir.
A couple more and I'm sold on this.
All right. Oh, not yet. Okay. I'll keep going.
I know, obviously, you're going to be naturally biased on this, but
yeah.
Do students enjoy these lessons?
Well, the feedback that I get from them is very positive. The feedback I get from them is very. I'm conscious. Sometimes, if they're not hooked in initially, there might be pockets that are not hooked in. And there are pockets of students in the room that might not be able to structure their learning or able to find a way forward. And I'm constantly on the alert for students who have lost their way. And if that's, well, like in any teaching, if that's a significant number, we come back together and we look at the cards again, and we have another discussion, and we might ask some more questions to direct us in our progress. So, I mean, I'm asking, this form of teaching is asking a great deal of students. It's asking them to learn maths and learn how to learn maths. It's very, very hard initially.
I'd say it's also asking a great deal of the teacher. It's a scary prospect, isn't it, if you've never done one of these lessons before, especially because if you don't know where the lesson's going to go. And I'm very fortunate that I get to watch a lot of teachers teach. And I know myself that it's the most comfortable place a teacher can be is at the front with 30 eyes looking at you in silence whilst you explain a concept.
Yeah, but if you're doing that in an inquiry lesson, there's not going to be any off-task behaviour. Well, there's less off-task behaviour. There's not going to be anybody chatting at the back, or there's not going to be people looking out the window, because actually they've asked for it.
Yes.
They have requested that I instruct them in a certain technique, a method, whatever, because they've recognised that they can't make progress without that instruction without that concept or skill that I'm talking about. Even more so, obviously, if it's a student who's doing that at the front. So I feel those moments are more successful in an inquiry lesson because it's come from the students.
Again, I'm pretty much convinced.
I'm getting there.
Final question then on this.
Okay.
How often are we doing these lessons then? I mean, we're not inquiring every lesson, are we?
Well, I think you could.
Okay.
because students will ask for different forms of learning, so they will different ways to take inquiries forward. So I think that you will get we do in inquiries. We get lots of different styles of learning and teaching going on. So they do get a variety of things happening. They might ask for a worksheet or an activity that I might have prepared before, or I might prepare for the next lesson. But at the moment I probably do about 2 with every class half term. And an inquiry might last. There's a ratio inquiry on the website that might last an hour and a half. The one that I'm into year 10 at the moment, I mean, we could be running to the end of the year with this because I'm so excited by the start that we made. Obviously it won't run to the end of the year, but it can open up. At the end of the first phase of that lesson, we had 3 different approaches. We had graphical, numerical and algebraic, and the next lesson we're going to start with the 3 different approaches and see how they relate to each other.
That's
so
brilliant.
we've represented the maths in different ways. And interestingly, there's a video on my website. Boom, boom. Okay, let's plug that in. What if it's the last question? I'll raise it again. There's a video on my website which actually talks through this lesson.
If you want to comment on how you've got on running an inquiry, do so on this new blog page, and hopefully Andrew may even visit there from time to time and share a few thoughts as well. For our second topic today, we're going to talk about the role of head of department. Andrew has been a head of department for 12 years and has mentored heads of department in his local authority. And for my part, I have sworn I will never ever go for a head of department job for all the money in the world. So let me start by asking you, Andrew, why did you want to become a head of department?
Okay, Craig. Well, no, I was going to say I wonder why myself, but that's not true because I love it. I love the position. I think middle management in a school, or middle leadership, I should say, is a very, very interesting role. I think the most interesting role in a school. So actually, the question I ask myself at the moment is, why do I resist? Why am I resisting going into senior leadership?
Right.
Why I became a head of department in the first place, I had some ideas about teaching and learning. It was 2001. My ideas about teaching and learning were in contrast or against the National Numeracy Strategy. And I wanted to influence, I suppose, in a very small way, obviously a department, with the ideas that I had about teaching. Inquiry maths was nowhere on the horizon.
Okay.
And actually what inspired me was CAME, Cognitive
Yes.
Acceleration in Maths Education, and that series of lessons, 30 lessons around key concepts in maths. And that's how, that inspired me to be interested in teaching and learning, and that led into me wanting to become a head of department.
So was this head of department in a school that you're already at, or was it moving to a new school to become head of department?
I moved schools to become a head of department.
Okay, now this interests me greatly, because so here you are, head of department, a new face in a new school, bringing in these new ideas.
Yes.
Now I assume that you'll have had staff there who've been there for many years maybe.
Yes.
How do you go about bringing about what is essentially a complete change in philosophy of the department?
Yes, just to go through my career development in a way. I was head of department at a school. I then moved to be head of department in another school, and then I moved back to the first school.
Right.
So in a way, I've kind of started 3 times in different schools, 2 different schools, and I faced this question 3 times.
Yeah, sure.
Well, you don't go in and say, well, interestingly, I was about to say something there that I didn't do the first time.
Right.
I did go in and say, we're teaching CAME.
Okay.
There are these 30 lessons through years 7 and 8. That's how it's designed, and we're going to do that. That's my introduction to the department, and there wasn't resistance. I mean, the nature of maths departments, unfortunately, is some aren't very stable.
Yes, absolutely.
And so when you do take over as a new head of department, the old team from the year before might not be as solid as you would expect, because there's going to be 2 or 3 new faces, perhaps 2 or 3 new colleagues, and actually, the situation might not be as stable as you would expect. So in some schools, it's quite, that opportunity does exist as a head of department to immediately affect change. The second school I went to, it was more established. I think I was the only new character, and my demands were much less in a way. I set a focus on what we would do, which is, I thought, quite low level. And we had one focus that observations and peer work revolved around. When I went back to the first school, I was set on introducing inquiries in a big way. This is my 3rd year there. I didn't introduce them immediately. I did some myself. I generated some interest amongst colleagues. In the 2nd year, there were 2 or 3 that were interested. It's only in the 3rd year that they're formally in the schemes of work. I support colleagues by running sessions on inquiries. So when an inquiry is coming up in the scheme of work, we will have a session on it. We will have a training session. We will evaluate how it's gone. So it's a well-supported process, and it's not you're doing it now, folks.
And how do you monitor the success of the changes that you've made? How do you know that all staff are doing them? And how do you know whether the strategy has worked?
Well, I don't. Well, between you and me and our listeners, who might be some of the people I'm talking about, I don't know that they have all been done. And we've got 3 NQTs, or we started with 3 NQTs at the beginning of the year, and my pressure on them is not so great in year 3 of my return. In year 4, it would be greater. So, I make allowances. This is very, the inquiry method I'm asking them to teach is very, very advanced, I think.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so, if they skip 1 or 2, I'm not looking at the moment. I'm obviously looking at the data that you mentioned earlier. I'm looking at data. I'm looking at progress. And if I can see that at a satisfactory level, then okay, we'll lay off inquiries. But inquiries will come in, in year 4. For those teachers. So as a head of department, you want a happy staff, you want a motivated staff, you want an excited staff, and innovative staff. And actually, the interest I've generated, or we've generated, around inquiries in our department this year, I think is fantastic. And to teachers are saying to me, I'm reinvigorated. I've been going along like this, and this is just great.
You see, this sounds absolutely superb, and this for me is almost in contrast to the role of head of department that I've experienced, and because I'm going to ask you in a second how your department's structured. But if I just say how our current department's structured, so we have a head of department, and we have kind of a second in department that's also kind of with Key Stage 3 responsibilities, and then we have a variety of TLR holders. So one will be numeracy across the curriculum, one will be intervention, one will be kind of primary transition, and then somewhere in the midst of it is me, who as an advanced skills teacher, my kind of drive is teaching and learning.
Yes.
So I, at the moment, am trying to do a similar thing to what you're doing, where we're rewriting the 7 and 8 schemes, where we're having compulsory, what I'm loosely calling rich tasks. So
right.
They might be inquiries, they might be enriched, they might be 3-act math stuff, they might be low barrier, high ceiling, tasks, and no longer are staff having a choice, because in the previous scheme of work that was there when I joined the school, they were kind of almost tagged on at the end as an optional extra. So you've got 6 lessons to teach fractions, here are your objectives, here are some resources, and then at the end, enrichment, you could do this, you could do this. Whereas I'm saying, no, forget that, you are doing this task.
That's what Ofsted complained about in Made to Measure, their survey of maths departments in May 2012, that using and applying wasn't evident, or not evident enough in maths classrooms, and if it was evident, the problem solving came at the end of the process.
Absolutely.
And actually to challenge students, it should be right up at the beginning, and that's another, going back to inquiry, another reason for doing inquiries, because it's right there. You develop the concepts, you make the links right from the beginning. Sorry, I've gone back to our first discussion. I keep wanting to go back.
No, you're absolutely, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So I'm driving that. I'm driving that as an advanced skills teacher.
What I would say, as a head of department, it depends on the team in front of you and the colleagues that you're working with. So when I went into the school I'm currently in first time, I wanted to make a big impact, and I wanted to say, I will support you. This is definitely what we're doing. It was quite an experienced staff, and I felt capable, that they would respond, in a professional way and do it, and they did. This time round with inquiries, because I think inquiries is one step on from CAME, or if not 2 or 3, and we've got some very inexperienced teachers. I'm not as insistent, perhaps, as I was in 2001 when I started in that department, and in the second department I was insistent again, perhaps at a lower level. So it depends on the makeup of the staff and the colleagues that you're working with, I think, on how insistent you are. Obviously you have a long-term aim. Your long-term aim is to get enriched as a fundamental part of problem solving, as a fundamental part of teaching and learning in your department, but you might have a longer time frame with more support in place, and more kind of intermediary goals. So, I would say, as that's the way I would play it.
So can I ask, what are the other kind of roles that exist within your maths department, and how do they kind of complement what you want to do as a head of department?
Well, we've just changed ours, but this year we've got we've got a head of year 9 and 10 and a head of year 7 and 8. We've got a part-time AST, and we've got me, and I take charge of year 11.
Oh, but it seems to me from what you're saying that are you driving the overall teaching and learning strategy? And if so, where do they kind of come in?
I am, in a way, I am driving the teaching and learning of the department. I think that, you see, this is really one of the things I want to say, that I think the head of department role is being de-skilled at the moment.
Right, well, yes.
And devalued. I go round and I mean, I'm not. These comments aren't related to any one school or any one individual I've met, but it's just a trend that I've observed, and I'm in contact with heads of department around the country, different regions of the country, and it seems to me what's happening is that senior leaders want maths to produce results. They've always wanted that, but even more so now.
Absolutely.
Maths is a forum for discussing A stars to C's. It's a forum for discussing 3 levels of progress, 4 levels of progress, and 5 levels of progress. It's a forum for discussing what exam board you're going to sit and how many exams they're going to sit. It's year 11, year 10, when they're going to sit, how many exams they're going to sit on what day, what level, what tiers of exams. They're the kind of discussions senior leaders have with maths departments. And unfortunately, what's happened is that there is a member of the senior leadership team, the raising attainment leader or whatever you want to call that person, who basically tells maths what to do. There is no space. The senior leaders don't perceive maths as a place for innovation, for creativity, for even to have discussions about teaching and learning perhaps. And the head of maths is becoming a functionary. To function, the function of the head of maths is to transmit the message of senior leaders down to the department. And the flow at the moment, and even more so now, is going one way. And the space for creation, for development of new ideas, for innovation, for finding what works with your students, and what helps them learn best, those kind of discussions are off the table. And I was never a fan of the national numeracy strategy because I'm not a fan of anyone who comes and says that's the way to do it, even inquiry. I want the debate. I'm going to try and convince you. You come and try and convince me. Unfortunately, the national numeracy strategy said this is it, and we're having the 3-part lesson. Unfortunately, I see signs of that now with Singapore maths. That's the way to do it. Actually, let's all get into that. Let's all dive on that. Let's buy some books around it, etc., etc. I don't think that's necessarily the way to do it, and I want them to convince me, I suppose, and I want to argue with people. But those debates are off the table. Those debates are off the table, unfortunately, in some schools. I'm not talking about all schools necessarily. There's an academy chain that teaches in one way, and I suppose if you want a job in that academy chain, you teach that way, and the debate's not open for debate. So I'm pessimistic about the role of head of maths in particular in the school at the moment. Even though it's a very interesting role, I believe, very creative, could be a very creative and even innovative role, I think at the moment the trend is to get someone in who's going to say, yes, I will sit students for every exam that comes up and every tier, and more than one board at a time and so on, and have those kind of discussions. And this is exactly what Made to Measure is arguing against, because Made to Measure talks about there's a problem in Key Stage 3. All the best teachers are concentrating on year 10, 11, or the most effective teachers. Perhaps we can call them the best teachers. The most effective teachers have put a 10 and 11 to get the results, leaving the less effective teachers in Key Stage 3. So where I suppose there could be space for this kind of debate that I'm talking about, it's falling on barren ground, unfortunately. So, I think, you've got one Department of Education sort of directive is this is how we're going to measure you, and that works against the Ofsted reports, which say, well, this is the kind of teacher we want. So, I think the trend is going too far towards that. I don't want to call it exam factory. That's a hackneyed cliche, but it's going too far that way. Let's open up the debate. Let's have heads of department. Let's employ heads of department who've got ideas, and employ them because they've got ideas. That was a bit of a rant, Craig, wasn't it? I don't know what the question was, but that's what I wanted to say.
No, it was good. It's fascinating, and I think it'll be in tune with what a lot of our listeners think.
Right.
I'll share a bit of my perspective on this. The first thing I should say before I get fired or my windows get put in is that I've worked in 2 schools.
Right.
I've been an advanced skills teacher for a local authority, so I've visited hundreds of schools, but I've worked. Spent a lot of time in 2 schools in particular. In both cases, we've been very fortunate to have very supportive senior leadership teams.
Right.
And I think what's helped in my first school, the senior leadership member who's kind of line manager for maths was a mathematician. So I think that helped, because I still am of the view, and this will be something I might ask in a second, that maths is almost standalone. I think that a lot of whole school inset training, I often feel doesn't sit particularly well with the maths department, but that's a separate issue. In my current school, again, the senior leadership team is very, very supportive of maths, and maths are very well resourced, and we get priority over a lot of other subjects, rightly or wrongly. However, Having said all that, the reason I said in my little intro why you couldn't pay me to be head of maths is that I've worked for 3 heads of maths, and each of them have said the same thing to me, that their teaching is the thing that suffers, and that their priority is not their teaching, because it's everything else that goes with it. So it's the pressure on the data. It's like you say, it's a numbers game. It's what are you projecting our A star to C is going to be this year, right? What are we going to do? Let's get some intervention going on. Let's take them out of that class and do some one-on-ones and all this. That doesn't interest me. What interests me is the overall picture of teaching and learning. Let's bring in these inquiries. Let's bring in these rich tasks. Let's not leave it till year 10 and 11 to start doing the intervention. Let's get them be problem solving from year 7 onwards. And whilst I see that if I became a head of department, I would possibly have a bit more power to do something like that, because at the moment I have to negotiate everything with my head of department and senior leadership. I'm just fear from the experience that I've seen that if I was to become a head of department, all right, I'd have that power, but I wouldn't have the time or the energy possibly, and it wouldn't be my priority anymore. And I feel that this is something that a lot of teachers think, because they see a natural career path to become head of department. If you're a maths teacher and want to progress, it's either head of department or it's some pastoral route.
Yes.
And with ASTs pretty much on the way out,
yes, there
isn't another route. And I fear for teachers who think, if I go to head of department, I'll be out of the classroom more, and even when I'm in the classroom, probably my mind won't 100% be on it because of all the other things that are going on, that all my other priorities are. Now again, I'm possibly painting a bleak picture here, but that is always a concern that I've had. And I wonder if yourself, as a very passionate teacher and who's very interested in teaching and learning, how do you kind of balance the two? How do you keep your eye on the teaching and learning game whilst also having all these numbers and targets and data in the back of your head?
Well,
there's my little rant anyway.
The pressure's extreme. I mean, national averages maths GCSE results are 5% A star to C, 5% lower than English, and it's always around 5-6%. So in the vast majority of schools, the pressure's on maths to catch English than the other way around. And so it's maths that gets the focus and gets the pressure. I would say you're absolutely ideal to be a head of maths. Not that we're in a job interview or anything, but I would say, the passion that you just expressed for teaching and learning is for me, is the fundamental role of a head of department. Now, what I have to ensure in my day-to-day operational kind of mode is that I create space for that, and I don't get swamped by data, by demands for this and that, by intervention, extra classes, by working at half term, by working the coming Saturday, and so on, which I'm doing all of those as many other heads of department, that I also create space for myself to do the other things that I'm passionate about. I suppose I'm an effective teacher in inverted commas, but I know that sometimes I stand, in front of classes and I am not giving, I'm on not a standby lesson, but I'm on not autopilot either, but I'm doing. I suppose all teachers do this,
of course.
and I'm doing, I'm doing a regular lesson.
Yes.
And that concerns me sometimes. I don't think that's necessarily me being head of department. That's just me surviving as a teacher, I suppose.
Yeah. But it's more prevalent for a head of department.
Well, no, I don't agree with you. If you've got these ideas that you're talking about, and I know many other people have as well. Obviously, probably many of the people that listen to this podcast, they are exactly the type of people that should be heads of department, because they're going to be motivated. They are going to be raise levels of excitement in classrooms, develop innovative approaches. Which is, what makes a department an exciting place to work in. If the leader is excited and innovative and motivated, then, it tends to be that their colleagues follow. And I don't get motivated. I know some people get motivated around data and intervention, and that's great, and they can generate excitement around that. My passion is teaching and learning, as yours is, and I want to generate excitement around that.
But you still have to do the other.
I still have to do the other stuff, yeah, and I do it, I think, effectively as well. Well, I have to do it effectively, otherwise in the current climate I wouldn't be head of maths for very long. But I'm very wary, or take great care to create that space, so that when I walk into a classroom, when I did this year 10 inquiry, the year 10 inquiry on Tuesday, my whole Monday evening and Tuesday morning was looking forward to that.
Right.
And I did other things, of course, prepared other lessons, looked at data, answered emails from parents and carers and whatever, and did all the usual stuff that a head of department does. But in the back of my mind, I was really excited about the prospect of this inquiry. And that actually generated motivation and excitement to do the rest of the stuff that I had to do. So it actually supports me doing a more effective job, I suppose, by having this creative kind of excitement to look forward to.
And would you say, hand on heart, your priority is still your teaching? Is that your
Well,
top priority?
it's not only my teaching, it's teaching and learning within the department and wider, I would say. I feel now that I've been head of department for 12 years and got this inquiry method together and talk about it to PGC students, I feel I've got a wider responsibility to the maths community, teaching community, to popularise this approach, which I believe in, and allow people to make up their own minds about it, and reject it, fine, or accept it, however they decide. But I now am in a position, after 12 years of being head of department, I feel responsible for the development of maths in this country, or maths teaching in this country. So I've kind of got to that level, and that's why I won't go into senior leadership. Because I will then I will lose contact with classrooms and teaching maths, and for me, this is where my priorities lie. So I'm very concerned at the moment that the rest of the educational community, especially senior leaders, are downgrading the head of maths role, and they're not encouraging people like you who see that as the priority, and it is the priority. And Made to Measure makes it clear that it's the priority, and it should be the priority in every department and for every head of department, I believe. I hope none of my colleagues take
I'm sure they won't.
Say anything against that, yeah.
I know, I'm sure a tremendous amount of people agree with you. So say we've got people listening here who are either thinking about becoming head of department in the next few years, or perhaps have got a job starting in September where they will be a head of department for the first time. Do you have any advice that you'd offer them?
I've done talks to, or run workshops to, only short sessions to new heads of department. And I would say my key piece of advice is do some research on the theory of team building.
Okay.
And understand the kind of phases that teams go through. Think very, very hard about day one, how you present yourself, because that is the first impression often a department will get of you as a professional head of department. Obviously you might visit the school for the day that you have earlier, but you won't be there as head of department. So day one, the tone you set, the agenda you set is absolutely key. And the impression you make on that day is far more important than on day two, and that's far more important than day three, and so on. So sort out day one, make the impact you want to make, be the head of department on that day you want to be, and try and do some research. There's some research around, or there's a theory around team building by Tuckman, 1965, long way back. Jeez. Yeah. You have, let me think. There are 4 stages: forming, you form the team; storming. There's a phase where the team will storm basically and start arguing with each other, and everyone should be trying to find their ground and make their pitch. Norming, when you kind of come to the 3rd phase, when you kind of come to agreement about how you're going to operate after this storming phase, and then the 4th stage is performing. And as a head of department, as a leader of a team, it's important to know where you are, so when the storming starts, you're ready for it. When people turn, there's going to be a honeymoon period, I suppose you could call it, in the forming stage, when people are on their best behaviour, but that's not going to last. Don't be frightened. Don't be frightened when the 2nd stage hits and people say, well, I don't like you, I'm not sure about you, I don't like this idea. Hold to your guns, basically, and just be aware of the different kind of models of team building that there are. That's the advice I would give.
That's brilliant. And if I can ask you one more final thing.
Yeah.
I think we've made 2 changes this year in our department around departmental meetings that I think have had a massive impact, and I want to know your experience of maths department meetings, what you think is most effective, because that's often the only time that the maths department sits together formally as a unit where kind of things can get discussed.
Yeah.
So the first change we made is that I'm very keen on having teaching and learning form an integral part of maths department meetings. And what we used to do is we used to have all the kind of admin-y stuff like remember your reports are due this time, fill out these predicted grades, exam dates, blah, blah. That always used to come at the start of the meeting, and then like the last 15, 20 minutes or whatever would be a teaching and learning thing. And it didn't work because the admin would just drag you down. People were drained, and then by the time I stand up to try and get a bit of teaching and learning going, they're like, let's go home. Exactly. So
Enough of this.
Yeah, so the first thing we did was we now have departmental meetings that are purely kind of admin, like short ones, and then we have a dedicated, every half term, we do a 2.5 hour after school teaching teaching and learning twilight, where we always run a couple of rich tasks that are coming up in the next half term, some new rich tasks that we're trialling out. So we run them almost as if we are students in the class. So I'll lead it, and then people will work together in groups, and then we'll assign one group to be a low ability, a middle ability, and a high ability, and they'll try and rewrite the task and restructure the task for those groups.
Yep.
And it's been nice. Like at first, staff were kicking up a bit of a fuss because they're having to stay till kind of 5:30, 6 o'clock. But it's become a really enjoyable kind of teaching and learning thing, and it's separated the teaching and learning from the mundane admin. So that's the first change we've made that's made a big difference. And the second change is a daft one. But we've started in departmental meetings, we always have them in a classroom, but we've put all the desks together and we sit round in a loop, in a table together, as opposed to kind of rows. And it's made a world of difference. I don't know whether it's the face-to-face interaction or the fact that you can't hide anywhere or kind of be on your phone or, gazing because everyone's in it together. And that's made, and when you said storming, it really kind of brought it to mind. Like, it's caused some arguments in meetings, but I'd rather have those arguments there than people just be simmering away.
Yeah, they have to come out. As a leader, they have to come out.
Exactly. And I think that's worked well. So they're 2 things that I've certainly taken on board from this year. And I wondered, have you any advice for heads of department of kind of making the most out of departmental meetings or departmental time?
We would, all the admin you just described, we would never have any of that in any meeting.
Right.
That would all be emails or face-to-face, or I wouldn't even consider putting any of that on the agenda.
Okay.
That's the first thing.
That's it.
I hope I'm not upsetting anyone with any of this stuff.
No.
Okay, our meetings are an hour long, and they're exactly an hour long.
Once a week, is that?
Well, their timetable probably once every 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay.
But we meet as a department once a week. We have voluntary sessions, which are more or less 100% attendance.
Okay.
And we would start on the dot 3:30, and we finish on the dot 4:30. Even mid-sentence. We have a rotating chair, so colleagues get the opportunity to chair the meetings. We have a timekeeper, so if there are 3 items, I don't know, 10, 30 and 20 minutes, they run 10, 30 and 20 minutes and they get cut. If anyone wants to say anything else, it has to be done afterwards in a different way. So colleagues know that they're walking, if they walk in late, we've started, and they are going to leave at 4:30, and that's it. So there's never any extension for any reason. There's never any other business. It's these are the items. They are all related to teaching and learning. So for example, we might have a session on, let's look at inquiry. We've got an inquiry coming up. Interestingly, our AST we're having a series at the moment, What is Outstanding Maths Teaching?
Okay.
So our head of our AST did her presentation last week, and I'm going to do one next week. What else have we done that's quite interesting? 3 colleagues a couple of weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, discussed how would you teach fractions.
That's nice.
Fractions are coming up in year 9. What's the first 15 minutes of the lesson? So you had 3 experienced colleagues say, well, this is how I would do it. All completely different. Of course, mine was inquiry. Totally inquiry.
You do surprise me.
My team said, oh, not again, man. We know what you're going to do. So it's all teaching and learning, and it's run. I think it's respectful to stop the meeting when you say it's going to stop. That really annoys me at meetings that run over, and that won't happen in our meetings. So. Yeah, all the admin is there's nothing like that.
That's really interesting, and I hope that's some good food for thought for either current or prospective heads of department. And whilst Andrew has definitely sold me on the inquiry, I'm not so sure about the role of head of department.
Oh, come on, Craig.
One day, maybe.
One day, please. You're just the sort of person we need.
We have a lot of, as we've spoken about, NQTs and PGCE students listening. Or even teachers who are perhaps looking for kind of a fresh approach. And we've obviously talked about the excellent inquiry model, but do you have any other kind of general advice for teachers? What kind of helped you as a teacher? What do you say to your NQTs? What advice do you give?
Well, when PGC students come in, and NQTs, the first thing I say to them is, you are welcome to try out any idea you have or you've seen. Obviously, if it's an NQT who's staying longer, I'd want some justification. Sure. I'd want to see some research, or I'd want to see, some proof that it works, the idea that they had. But I say to PGC students especially, look, enter the profession and don't think there's one way. Don't, not even the inquiry method. Try the inquiry method. Use it occasionally if you like it. Use it a lot if you like it. But there are different ways to teach, as you've just said, different ways students learn, and we need to be a profession that discusses these different models. Going back to the national numeracy strategy, unfortunately, the kind of hangover of that was actually there's one way to do it. There's one best way, and there are lots of models of teaching. And what we don't have in this country, I believe, is a debate about what is the best way to teach maths. We have various kind of activities around problem solving, around rich tasks, but is that the best way? I mean, that's the way we're going. Singapore method, is that the best way? Where is the professional discussion? Unfortunately, I don't think the professional bodies, the Association of Teachers of Mathematics and Mathematical Association, they, at the moment, unfortunately, they seem to be on the margins of the mainstream profession.
That's right.
And that they could be the forum that run those debates amongst teachers. I'm talking about not amongst university professors or whatever. I'm talking about what works in classrooms, and why aren't we having that discussion, and where are the forums to have that discussion? So, from my point of view, going back to the original question, I say to new teachers, be on the lookout, try new ideas, and I would love you to introduce something new into this department.
Absolutely. And I'd chuck in my own kind of little bit of advice there is, I used to get all my kind of best ideas from LEA consultants back in the day when I was an NQT, but obviously those days are pretty much over. But I'd say blogs are the way forward. If you're looking for the latest, most innovative, original ideas, and if you are willing to take a risk, there are just some phenomenal bloggers out there. And it's like you say, it's not university professors, it is real teachers who are trying things out with kids and who are saying, right, here, this is what I've tried, now you give it a go.
And find them on Twitter.
Absolutely.
Get on Twitter. It's not, don't waste your life, which is the danger once you get on there. But get on Twitter, make the professional links with the bloggers who are generally, tweeting away as well.
Absolutely.
And find those opportunities. I totally agree with you.
Absolutely. Well, final question.
And follow me on Twitter as well. Of course. And Craig, of course.
We'll include that, don't worry about that. And final question, Andrew, is you've talked before about how you really enjoy the role of head of department, but you also talked about almost a frustration that the message coming through from senior leadership team was almost in contrast to some of the things that you perhaps believed.
And you.
And myself as well, and many people. So I guess that begs the question of why you'd be resistant to move into senior leadership team to instigate those changes yourself.
You see, that's the question I ask myself. But I am a committed classroom teacher, first and foremost. I want to teach children, and I want them to learn with me. And unfortunately, moving into senior leadership doesn't have to, but it generally goes along with I'm moving away from the classroom, and that is something I can't do. So I am passionate about teaching and staying in the classroom, and this is the kind of the highest you can rise without losing touch. Well, not necessarily losing touch, but the balance goes completely the other way. I mean, an assistant head teacher might have half a timetable, so there's still an amount of teaching, but that assistant head teacher probably feels their main role is the whole school role that they've got.
Absolutely.
And for me, my main role is still teaching.
That's a very good answer. Well, it's that time of the show again where we like to tax your brains a little bit with a podcast puzzle, and I'm delighted to say that my guest Andrew has brought one along, so I will hand over to him.
Okay, Craig, well, I very much like problems that I can turn into inquiry prompts. And I saw a problem on Twitter, which I then turned into the prompt that I talked about earlier. Okay. And the prompt is, which is a problem in itself, I suppose, the difference sum and product of two numbers are the first three terms of a sequence. And that was a problem, or came from a problem I saw on Twitter, but stripped right back to its kind of essence.
Okay.
and suitable for a secondary audience.
Okay.
This is suitable for a higher level audience.
All right, as our listeners are. Here we go.
Indeed.
So pens and pencils are ready. Here we go.
Here we go. The solution is has been worked out by a colleague of mine in another school in my local authority, and is on the website.
Okay.
If people get.
Okay. Here we go.
Want to cheat us? I shouldn't say that. Right. Here we go. The sum, difference, product, and quotient of two numbers are the first four terms of an arithmetic sequence. What is the value of the fifth term?
Right, let's go one more time on that.
Yeah,
one.
no reordering.
No reordering. All right,
yeah,
let's
this is
have
the
that
order.
again.
The sum, difference, product, and quotient of two numbers are the first four terms of an arithmetic sequence. What is the value of the fifth term?
There we go. An answer, if you need it, available on Andrew's website, and we'll put a link to that on the podcast page. Well, we've reached the end of another TES Maths podcast. I would like to once again offer some massive thanks to Andrew for giving up his time and sharing his fascinating ideas. So thanks so much, Andrew.
Well, thank you, Craig, for inviting me, and I've enjoyed it immensely.
That's brilliant. And just a reminder that you can get links to all the ideas and resources discussed on our dedicated podcast page. That is www.tes.co.uk/mathspodcast. And a reminder that we have a new feature where you can access a blog dedicated purely to this podcast, where you can comment on any of the ideas we've discussed today. So just a reminder, that's Inquiry Maths. We've also touched on the role of the head of department, and we've also touched on outstanding maths lessons. So feel free to share your thoughts on there, and I'm sure Andrew will be nipping on there from time to time to answer any questions that you may have. And finally, a reminder to please follow me on Twitter at TES Maths. And as Andrew says, there's some remarkable people to follow on Twitter. We'll put a link to Andrew's Twitter handle on our podcast page as well. And I will see you next time for podcast 10, where I will once again be out and about.